It is probably one of the most famous air accidents ever.
A commercial aircraft, a U.S. Airways flight from New York to Charlotte, lands in the Hudson River in New York City.
The miracle on the Hudson inspired and fascinated millions of people around the globe and was even portrayed in a movie with Tom Hanks. Today we're going to take a detailed look at the sequence of events that happened on that fateful day, and we're going to find out what aviation learned from it. Welcome to Airspace. On January 15, 2009, US Airways Flight 1549 was due to operate the route from New York's LaGuardia Airport to Charlotte, North Carolina. On the flight deck were 57-year-old Captain Chesley Sullenberger and First Officer Jeff Skiles, age 49. The pair had been flying together for 4 days already, and the upcoming flight would be the last one of their trip. Both men were looking forward to a few calm days off at their respective homes. For First Officer Skiles, the flights on the A320 with Captain Sullenberger marked the first ones without an instructor, as he had just recently completed his training on the Airbus. Before that, he had flown the Boeing 737 and the Fokker 100, and had even been a captain at one point. Even though he had a spotless record, he had been demoted to First Officer due to financial difficulties of the airline he formerly worked at. January 15th was a typical New York winter day, with temperatures well below freezing at -6 degrees Celsius or 21 Fahrenheit, and a cloudy sky. Fortunately, no snow was falling from the overcast sky, so the crew was able to omit the de-icing procedure. At 25 minutes past 3 in the afternoon, Cactus 1549 was cleared for takeoff from runway 4. Cactus is the radio call sign for US Airways. Full power was applied and First Officer Skiles took the aircraft into the grey New York skies. It must have been a sight to see, since Captain Sullenberger even remarked, "What a sight of the Hudson today," shortly after they had started to retract the flaps of the Airbus A320. Little did he know at that point that they would get a much closer look at the Hudson a few minutes later. Just 1 minute and 32 seconds after liftoff, the captain spotted and called out "birds" as they suddenly came into view all around the aircraft. At this point, the aircraft had just climbed to 2,800 feet. In the following moments, the A320 was battered by large birds later identified as Canada geese. It took multiple hits to both engines as well as the fuselage of the aircraft. First Officer Skiles exclaimed, "Oh shit," and Sully reacted with, "Oh yeah." In his book, Sully described the events as follows. "Within a few seconds, we felt a sudden, complete and symmetrical loss of thrust. It was unlike anything I'd ever experienced in a cockpit before. It was shocking and startling, there is no other way to describe it. It became eerily quiet thereafter." Even though he looked back on a long career of flying at that point, he had never experienced a single engine failure, let alone a complete one. "Within 8 seconds, the realization hit me. It was the most sickening feeling ever," he describes. Immediately, he took control of the aircraft and started the APU, that is the Auxiliary Power Unit. As it would later be revealed, this small action would be very beneficial to the outcome of the flight. Next, he ordered the First Officer to perform the checklist for loss of thrust on both engines. He knew that the checklist was not ideal given the terrible noises the engines made as they wound down. Sully assumed that they would never be able to run again. But they had to try something, and that checklist was their best chance. At this point, the aircraft became a powerless glider, descending at over 1,000 feet per minute. The two pilots had less than 3 minutes to find a suitable landing spot. Half a minute after the birds hit, the captain declared an emergency and in a very short message described what happened. Initially, he turned back towards LaGuardia. But as he did so, he realized that he was already way too low, too slow, and that a flight towards the airport would take them straight over Manhattan, one of the most densely populated places on the Earth. What if they would not make it? There would be hundreds of casualties. When the air traffic controller handling Cactus 1549 suggested runway 13 in LaGuardia, the famous response came quickly. "We're unable. We might end up in the Hudson." In disbelief, the controller cleared them for an approach to runway 13 anyway. Again, Sully told him that he was unable and that he saw another runway on the other side of the river. The controller told him that this was Teterboro Airport, and Sully confirmed he wanted to try a landing there. But just 20 seconds later, the captain had the impression that they would just not make it to that runway, and again transmitted, "We can't do it, we're gonna be in the Hudson." In disbelief, the air traffic controller asked, "I'm sorry, say again?" He would later state that he had heard just right, but could not wrap his mind around the words. People don't survive water landings. I thought it was his own death sentence. I believed I was the last person to talk to that plane, he recalls. Sully's A320 cleared the George Washington Bridge and was soon lined up with the Hudson River. As it descended through 1,000 feet, he gave a short address to the passengers. This is the captain, brace for impact. At that moment, he simultaneously looked out of the window and thought to himself that the river really looked cold today. In the meantime, First Officer Skiles frantically tried to restart the battered engines, but to no avail. The Airbus soon descended below the tops of the skyscrapers around it. When it passed 250 feet, the captain ordered the first officer to deploy the flaps partially to help them slow down for landing. For a while, as the aircraft bled off speed, it flew almost parallel to the water surface. But as the airspeed faded, the A320 inevitably started descending towards the cold water again. 20 seconds before impact, Sully asked Skiles, "Got any ideas?" To which the latter replied, "Actually not." Alarms blared through the cockpit as the plane made its final descent. 3 minutes and 30 seconds after the bird strikes, the plane hit the frigid water near the ferry terminal at Weehawken, New Jersey. Its touchdown was captured by a nearby surveillance camera. On the flight deck, the pilots must have been relieved. Almost in unison, they told each other, that wasn't as bad as they thought. But also, they knew that now an evacuation lay just ahead of them. Since the public address system didn't work anymore, Sully got up and called out to the flight attendants that they should evacuate the aircraft. He was satisfied to see that they had already started doing that. Water started rushing into the aircraft from the back, and it quickly became evident that it was not advisable to open the rear doors. Instead, passengers were redirected to be evacuated through the forward doors and overwing exits. Due to a malfunction, the front right door started closing again and threatened to damage the now inflated life raft. A passenger quickly volunteered to hold the door open. Passengers then evacuated under his arm, which was pushing back the door. Outside, the air temperature was well below freezing and the water temperature was at just 5 degrees Celsius or 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Most passengers remained unhurt and scrambled onto the wings. One passenger, in panic, jumped into the water and tried to swim to the shore. He later changed his mind and returned to the life rafts with strong hypothermia. The flight attendant that had been sitting in the rear of the aircraft noticed only when she was in the life raft that she was severely injured, sporting a long and deep gash in her leg that had been caused by a beam of the cargo compartment that had penetrated the cabin floor upon touchdown. She was given first aid by surrounding passengers. Nearby ferry captains had seen the aircraft splash down or heard about it on the radio and quickly made their way to the downed aircraft. Within minutes, help arrived for the passengers who were huddled together on the wings and rafts. One by one, they were lifted aboard and brought to the nearby ferry terminals. Due to the current of the river, passengers were dropped off at different stations, which initially made it difficult to tell if everyone had made it to the shore. Some groups were separated, with some family members ending up on the New York side, others ending up on the New Jersey side of the Hudson. 4 hours after the crash, it became clear that everyone had made it out alive. In his book, Captain Sullenberger describes this moment as one of great and unimaginable relief. The air traffic controller that had tried to help Flight 1549 had been relieved from his duties shortly after the aircraft touched down in the Hudson. This is normal after aircraft accidents. He was brought to a small room without a TV or internet for questioning and drug testing, and only later learned that the aircraft had not been destroyed. He too stated that he was in disbelief, as he really had thought everyone aboard must have died in a tragic crash. The aircraft remained in the Hudson for now. It drifted downstream and eventually became trapped at the riverbank and would only be salvaged a few days later. Now, let's analyze all aspects of this accident. Rumors started spreading quickly after the crash, especially that one engine would have still produced thrust, or that the crew could have actually made it to an airport. Let's find out if they were true. But first, let's take a look at the initial actions taken by the pilots. Right away, Captain Sullenberger took control, which is certainly wise in such a situation, and with the first officer who is quite new to the aircraft. He also started the APU, which made flying a lot easier. As the engines died slowly, they were also unable to drive the electrical generators attached to them. The loss of electrical power would have meant that the aircraft would have been harder to fly, and many systems would have been lost as the aircraft shed load under emergency power. This power is only provided by a small propeller turning in the wind, the so-called ram air turbine. The power of the APU also enabled all flight computers to continue to operate, which kept the aircraft in the normal control law. This meant that all protections against stalling remained active and controlling the aircraft remained rather easy. The pilots also commenced the engine dual failure checklist in the hope to restart at least one of their engines. That checklist was however not really created for a situation like theirs. Airbus thought that a dual engine failure was more likely to happen in cruise and therefore created a checklist for such a case. It assumed that the pilots would have a lot of time and altitude to troubleshoot, which Sully and Skiles clearly didn't have. The checklist spanned over multiple pages and is rather convoluted. Keep this in mind for the conclusion of the video. While First Officer Skiles was busy trying to restart the engines, Captain Sullenberger was looking for the best place to perform the upcoming forced landing. Should it be one of LaGuardia's runways, one at Teterboro, or would they ultimately end up in the Hudson? According to his testimonies, he didn't calculate whether they could make it to either of these airports, but rather he judged the situation by eye and experience. As he did so, he did not realize that he was flying somewhat slower than the optimum descent speed. This resulted in higher than required angles of attack of the aircraft, which would be important later in the sequence of events. Most likely, according to him and the NTSB, he was incredibly focused on flying and became task saturated, suffering from tunnel vision. This is a very common phenomenon in emergencies. The NTSB and Airbus recreated the events of that fateful day in a simulator with actual pilots. These pilots were briefed on what would happen and were given the task of landing successfully. More than half of them actually made it to a runway in LaGuardia or Teterboro. However, they only succeeded when they immediately turned after the virtual birds struck the aircraft. To account for real-life conditions such as the startle effect, initial analysis and decision-making, the board factored in a 35-second delay before a turn was allowed for a later attempt. In this simulation, nobody made it back to any airport. The decision to perform a forced landing on the Hudson was therefore a reasonable one. But how does one actually perform a water landing? All passenger aircraft need to be certified for such a ditching scenario. The Airbus A320's ditching certification dates back to 1988, a year before its first flight. To achieve it, analysts conducted over 200 tests with model aircraft and determined that an optimal ditching should occur under the following conditions: landing gear retracted, 11 degrees pitch on splashdown, a minus 0.5 degrees glide angle, and flaps in the landing configuration and minimum speed. According to Airbus, this would result in a touchdown at about 210 feet per minute, which is quite soft. However, in the original certification, Airbus assumed that the ditching would be performed with at least one engine running. But the board found out that the defined target values were all but impossible to achieve during a ditching without engine power, like the one of US Airways 1549. On that day, Sully's aircraft touched down at 750 feet per minute, almost 4 times the certified value. This was in part due to the fact that the aircraft was already at a high angle of attack due to the lower than optimal speed, which made the landing somewhat more difficult. Still, Sully managed to achieve a pitch of 9.5 degrees on touchdown, which is very close to the optimum of 11 degrees. During the touchdown at a rather high rate of descent, the rear underside of the aircraft suffered damage, allowing water to enter the aircraft. Just to clarify, I'm not trying to say that this landing was bad. As I stated before, achieving the perfect ditching with an aircraft without power is almost impossible. Of note here is also the fact that as the captain tried to achieve the 11 degrees of pitch, he held the side stick in the full back position. The nose, however, never rose to 11 degrees, in part due to the fact that the Airbus high angle of attack protection prevented the nose from rising any further due to the low speed of just 125 knots, which was 20 knots below the minimum speed. Now, let's also look at why the engines failed in the first place. As you might know, engines must be certified to withstand some bird strikes. Why did they fail on January 15, 2009? I'm always surprised by the thoroughness of the investigators that analyze these accidents. The final report states that multiple Canada geese, weighing on average 8 pounds, struck each engine. The birds that struck the left engine were male and female, while only male remains were found in the right engine. Make of that info what you will. Investigators came to the conclusion that the engines simply were not designed to withstand impacts by birds of that size and weight. It was also quite unlucky that the birds hit the center of each engine, which caused damage to the engine's cores. Had they only hit the edge of the fan, for example, it would have been much more likely that the engines would have been damaged, but remained functional to some degree. To the pilots, the extent of the damage was not exactly known. While they determined that they were most likely damaged beyond repair, they did not know for sure. The NTSB stated that if there had been a warning that indicated to the pilots that the engines were too far gone, they would have focused on other vital things in the moment. Eventually, the board reached the conclusion that the accident really had been caused by the unfortunate and unforeseen double bird strike into both engines. Investigators noted that given the circumstances, the decision to land on the Hudson was the right one and that it increased the odds of survival for everyone on board. But the NTSB also noted that while the crew's performance and the outcome of the day were admirable and well above standard expectations, a lot of luck was also involved. Good visibility, calm weather and water, daylight and the presence of nearby rescuers greatly increased the odds of survival. However, they noted that improvement in several areas is needed and included multiple suggestions. For one, the NTSB thinks that it is high time that engine and aircraft manufacturers should find ways to accurately display the state of engines to pilots after a malfunction. Every engine already has a plethora of sensors, and it should therefore be possible to indicate to pilots whether it is worth to even attempt to restart an engine. Another recommendation that has in fact been implemented is the creation of a checklist for total engine failure at low altitude. This checklist would have greatly helped the crew of Flight 1549, but alas, it wasn't available at the time. It is however available today and is dubbed the Sully checklist in the airline I work for, since it more or less dictates the actions performed by Sully and his first officer. Lastly, the board looked into the possibility of fitting screens or meshes in front of jet engines in order to avoid future bird strikes. However, in consultation with manufacturers, more problems than solutions were found. Such meshes would disturb the airflow to the engines and make them less efficient. Also, they would be very prone to ice formation and therefore would need to be heated, which would add a lot of weight to the aircraft. And ultimately, if such a screen was to fail and be sucked into an engine, the resulting damage would be devastating to the engine, essentially causing the problem it is trying to fix. The problem remains unsolved and protective screens on engines remain infeasible to date. So, by now I hope you have learned all you ever wanted to know about Sully and the flight of US Airways 1549. Besides the normal preparation for this video, I have read Sully's book Highest Duty and also watched the movie with Tom Hanks. I was positively surprised by how much the movie got right, so if you'd ever want to watch a good aviation movie, I can recommend that one. Sure, some parts are overly exaggerated, especially the NTSB hearings, but all in all, the story is told quite accurately. The book Sully wrote is really good too, by the way. The aircraft involved in the accident was lifted out of the Hudson 3 days after the splashdown. It was on display at Carolina's Aviation Museum until that museum recently closed for renovations. Sully returned to active duty until he finally retired in 2010. For his final flight, he was once again joined by First Officer Jeff Skiles. Jeff Skiles went on to fly the Boeing 787. Sully, on the other hand, continued working in aviation-related jobs. He was just recently appointed by President Biden and the Senate as the US representative to the Council of the International Civil Aviation Organization. Now, let me know what you think about the accident and about Captain Sullenberger. Is Sully a hero to you, or simply a man who did his job at the right time? Let me know in the comments. If you liked the video, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Or if you wish, become a supporter on Patreon. Your contribution greatly helps me make long and thorough videos like this one. That said, thank you all for watching and see you all in the next one.